Hello, everyone. It is very late for this, but this is what we're going to be calling the late night streams from now on. This is just office hours, but later when all the normies are gone. I've got a number of options. I've been wanting to go over this talk since this came out a couple days ago. I don't know if that's well advised. I also want to talk about, weirdly, some stuff around Bloodborne and weird tropes around connecting academia and horror in a lot of recent fiction, which I guess is not that recent. It's been a thing since at least H.P. Lovecraft, but it's something I'm interested in. And then I was watching a video on Joker Oscar scenes, which gave me some thoughts on Thomas Hobbes and whatnot. Probably very pretentious and meaningless, but, you know, my kind of thing. We'll just start this thing going. See where we end up.
Alright, I'm here with Joel Davis, and we're going to be discussing kind of the convergence of our thought that's been happening, and we feel like we're coming to some kind of consensus around philosophy of nationalism. But it's been interesting. I mean, the last time I talked to you, you were originally kind of into the post-liberalism, like Deleuze and some of these kinds of thinkers, the Adam Katz stuff, generative anthropology. The last time I talked to you, you were kind of going more you converted to Catholicism, and you were going more sort of a conventional route in political philosophy.
Let me know how the
Um,
audio is.
but yeah, why don't you tell me a bit about where your thoughts been going recently? I think there's been some interesting directions there.
Yeah, so last year I got into like kind of traditionalist Catholicism and even like the kind of post-liberal scene at milieu originally was kind of like, well, there's a problem with modernity. And that problem we call liberalism, I guess. And what's the solution? And so I was very attracted to this kind of synthesis of classical pre-modern ideas with postmodern.
Fascists and Deleuze are the fucking worst, I agree. Oh yeah, just a heads up, these two are fascists. So, we're going into the deep end here. If at all, can you possibly react to the Aaron McIntyre video, Democracy is Already Dead? It's only 8 minutes. Yeah, I can do that. The rest of tonight's not particularly planned out anyways, so. Are liberalism and nationalism not compatible? Well, that's an interesting question. Liberalism in its earliest forms presumed a state of affairs in which the border was sort of free going. You could come and go as you please. That's the whole idea behind the principle of tacit consent. You consent to your government despite the fact that you're born into it. This is Locke's point. Because you accept its benefits, its protections, etc. And obviously it's not consent if you have no choice to do otherwise. So the assumption is that by choosing to remain where you are and to continue to take those benefits, you are tacitly consenting to the rule of the government, or to the authority of the state. And if you wish to not be under that sovereign, you're free to leave. Problem with nationalism is that, among other things, it assumes some intrinsic relationship between the territoriality of a state and ethnic belonging, such that you can't just easily transplant yourself from one to another if you find that the rule of some regime doesn't suit your taste. Yeah? That makes sense? Oh, the problem with human rights by cut philosophy. That'd be interesting to see. Yeah, I might look at that one too. I'm not sure how far I'm going to go with this one. These two are clowns, but they're somewhat interesting clowns. Pretentious and fake in a lot of ways, but they go a significantly farther distance than somebody like the Woodefaltist.
Ideas. And then through that process, that led me down a path towards Catholicism. But early days in Catholicism, I was, it was an appeal for reactionary thought. Like they already had an appreciation from the previous era of absolutist and medieval, political philosophies. And so that kind of reactionary, counter-revolutionary standpoint really made sense to me. And I was reading a lot of, like De Maistre and some of these other counter-revolutionary thinkers.
I hate De Maistre.
But in the development of my thought, and also trying to update my political understanding with like more contemporary Catholic political teaching, I kind of realized the folly of the reactionary worldview, as well as in combination with that, developing more of a kind of sociological understanding of what modernity fundamentally is.
There's nothing more pretentious than using the word folly in this day and age.
And so my position has evolved towards nationalism, basically, in a nutshell. And we'll get into that today. But what it really rests upon is this distinction I call between conceptual modernity and structural modernity. So generally speaking, the reactionary critique of modernity is conceptual. So it criticizes certain qualities about modernity, egalitarianism, individualism, secularism, rationalism in a way, mercantilism, as though these are all outgrowths of this conceptual development that occurred
Mercantile omni-subjectivism. Does anybody remember that?
in the so-called Enlightenment. But what kind of shifted my thinking in this is appreciating the structural conditions of modernity, particularly the work of Bertrand de Juvenel, his book On Power, but various other...
Are they white
theorists
nationalists?
in
Indeed
different
they are.
fields, many of whom
The one on the
make
right's an
videos
Irish
about on my
Republican.
channel, and I reference in
The one on the left is a weirdo with a beard.
various places in my my appearances online, into developing a kind of theory of, okay, what is modernity structurally, and how did this impose a paradigm in which the conceptual innovations of modernity became necessary. And the fundamental thesis of Juvenal in his structural analysis of modernization in, not just Western politics, but fundamentally world politics, is, when you make an innovation that makes you more competitive, everyone has to copy your innovations in order to compete. I mean, otherwise, you just dominate them. And that's exactly what happened with, modernity, with, European states innovating statecraft, innovating social and political organization, and imposing it on the world through imperialism, or inspiring them to, imitate the Western model in order to become competitive with Western states, or even just like Central and Eastern European powers against Western European powers. So I think that's what's interesting to me here, is that this reactionary critique of conceptual modernity, it is as though, if we just had different concepts, we could go back to, what was good about the pre-modern era. And I sympathize with a lot of the sentiments. But the problem is that the structure of modernity isn't going anywhere. And so we have to come up with a solution to the conceptual problems with modernity that fits the modern structure. And so, in a way, we have to become modernists rather than reactionaries in order to actually deal with modernity as such.
Yeah, so in a way, separating it into a structural and conceptual critique of modernity, I mean, it doesn't quite fall that way, but it kind of falls in like a left-right approach to criticizing modernity. So in a way, I guess the attempt is to kind of marry them and synthesize them and find a way beyond that. So I mean, I guess when you say conceptual modernity, it's more of an ideological critique. So like you said, it's kind of the outgrowths of modernity, like egalitarianism, atheism, rationalism, economism. Whereas I guess what you would call the structural critique of modernity is what we typically associate with Marxism.
Yeah, but I think there's flaws with Marx's model. I mean, I mentioned the work of Bertrand de Juvenel in his book On Power because I see it as a far superior analysis of structurally what's going on with modernity, and the kind of political economists that I prefer, Thorstein Veblen, Joseph Schumpeter, who again kind of more compatible with this. I think the ideology of nationalism and the structural critique of Bertrand de Juvenel. But fundamentally, I would define structural modernity as having essentially four key factors in the production of the modern state. The first three are industrialization, bureaucratization, and centralization. Now, and these three kind of form a complex that then gives rise to mass communication, because with industrialization, bureaucratization, and the centralization of social organization, this enables a kind of mass communicative apparatus, i.e. the internet, so people like you and I can actually have a conversation where it previously wouldn't have been possible. And this fundamentally transforms how politics gets set up. So, and Juvenel's point is that, well, you can't just reject industrialization, bureaucratization, and centralization, because the states that do this, they become more competitive, because it enables you to build massive militaries, to build complex economies, to develop technological innovations, and project your communicative apparatus in a way that you can mobilize large populations in support in ways that previously weren't possible. And so these confer structural competitive advantages.
Just see, what the fuck are you talking about? This is incoherent. What is he talking about? He's just listing... Like... This is incomprehensible. I actually can't understand what his point is. I wonder if... I just want to see until Joel responds, because I want to see if they actually can talk to each other, if this is actually as incoherent as I think it is.
So my fundamental thesis is that this complex of these four factors means that democracy or mass mobilization is not fundamentally a conceptual aspect of modernity.
Democracy or mass mobilization. Mass mobilization is not, in any universe, synonymous with democracy. This is a corporate seminar for Paul. I like that.
It is fundamentally a structural innovation in modernity, and because simply mass mobilization defeats the kind of aristocratic, patrimonial relationships of the pre-modern feudal order. Simply industrialization and the bureaucratization of like the administrative state produced the necessity for a kind of technocratic apparatus, if you will, a technical apparatus.
Yes, I think what we're getting at is the reactionary kind of conceptual critique of modernity. That there's something in that, like it does kind of resonate with us, like the critique of the excesses of the ideology that's associated with modernity. Like we said, the egalitarianism, the economism, the
What the hell is economism?
secularism. But that what gets left out of this analysis a lot of times is that this is all downstream from the structural critiques of modernity, which you tend to find more in leftism.
Why do I find them interesting? You ever have like a sore tooth that you just can't stop wiggling? It's like that. It's painful, but it's an interesting kind of pain.
The economic basis of this, industrialization, centralization, the nature of the state and modernity. So I think what we're getting at is that you have proliferating in kind of the distant right these reactionary critiques, but they're kind of just floating in the ether. There isn't really, you have all of these like reactionary Twitter accounts and YouTube channels, and it's a lot of rehashing of like Spengler and these types of thinkers, Joseph de Maistre.
Spengler's legitimately interesting. He's like the political science equivalent of like a Blavatsky. Something like that.
But in terms of what these people are proposing, there isn't anything like unified there. You have kind of an absurd position where you have like, you have monarchists in the US, and you have people that are just kind of in favor of a vague absolutism. But then, they'll deconstruct the idea of popular sovereignty, or they'll deconstruct the idea of kind of rationally coming to a proper or moral social order, which is then they're in this weird position of just affirming absolutism kind of for the sake of absolutism, where they're at the point where it's like they lose their ability to critique liberalism as a bad or an immoral system. So it's like we recognize something in the kind of conceptual reaction.
Well, why would you critique liberalism as an immoral system? It's not an immoral system. We're beyond. We're not like in the realm of morality here, right? We're talking about like what are the fundamental constituent parts of a community. Like what are the relevant moments in a description of what a community is made up of. Liberalism just comes downstream from the Hobbesian idea that communities are at bottom aggregates or relations between, I guess, agents bearing certain like drives and aversions or whatever. You know, depending on who you follow, it's the point though is you isolate it down to the individual person, who relates to other persons for reasons intrinsic to them.
Critique of these trends, but it's like you have to integrate the structure of modernity into your analysis and try and find some kind of synthesis of the structural or the conceptual critique, because if it's all of these conceptual sort of reactionary critiques, you know, egalitarianism is bad, secularism is bad, but then you've no kind of rational basis for proposing another order, then, you know, it's just empty critique. And the reason that they don't have a rational basis for proposing another order is because they're not integrating the structure of modernity into their analysis and fundamentally trying to find a way to make that make sense. Or otherwise, what are you going to have except some kind of, you know, neo-Ludditism, which, again, there's nothing that you can really propose with that. You know, it's like, well, tear down industrial society. Well, you know, what does that look like as a program? I mean, you're kind of just at an endpoint then.
Yeah, so like aristocracy as a structure, it makes sense in, you know, medieval feudal society, because your capacity to mobilize a military is, I mean, there is, I guess you could say, a technological aspect, but you're not building like nuclear weapons and trying to move mass armies of hundreds of thousands of men across territories. So aristocracy makes sense because you just need to get together all the noblemen who, can ride around on a horseback and show up for you to like defend your, like, the kind of more primitive feudal political order from its adversaries. Whereas the modern state, because of the effects of industrialization and bureaucratization, the modern state requires far larger scale. And that scale requires, as I said before, a technical apparatus. It requires it. So technocracy fundamentally replaces aristocracy. And
I see what's going on. So he's thinking of the state as just a thing that's always there. There's just always this thing called the state throughout history, and what happens is it just grows. It just gets bigger and bigger. It's always there, but it just gets bigger. And at some point in the distant past, there's some magical moment where it stops being a state and it's something else, polis or whatever. But after some point in history, it's just always a state. It just gets bigger. And when we're talking about liberalism, we're talking about just a way we decide to kind of organize that thing, the contents of that thing, and that's all. And aristocracy can be more suitable than liberalism because that too is just a way of organizing stuff. But it's not super appropriate for the modern world because states are just too big. You can't assemble all of the horsemen to run things. And the only problem is that this mode of analysis is completely fucking stupid because aristocracy refers to the rule by a particular part of a political community, namely the best, or the nobles, as these two are often conflated, whereas liberalism refers to a particular account of the ontology of the state. What are the roots of power? What is it constituted of? From where do things like authority and sovereignty and all that other stuff, where do those come from? These aren't the same kind of thing at all. There's no contradiction between liberalism and aristocracy. There's no contradiction between liberalism and monarchy. There have been liberal monarchs. This is just absolutely nonsensical. This stuff is not complicated. It's interesting. It's it's it can be a little bit difficult to wrap your head around, just because when you take so much of it for granted, it's like you don't know what to question. So when people question certain things, it seems weird. But this stuff isn't complicated. Philosophy is way harder. Political science, political theory, it's easy. It's fun. But this is not what these guys are doing. These guys are playing make believe. This is just bad. This is just really bad. Aristocracy is widely popular in much later and earlier periods, by the way, than the Middle Ages, whatever that refers to. Middle Ages can be, periodization is a sketchy business. His transition ideas don't make any sense. That is true. Very little of what this man has said makes sense. It is quite baffling to see. We'll let this run for a few more minutes, but I don't think we're going to run for that long, just because this looks just oh god, he's got a he's got a whiteboard.
And the capacity for hereditary monarchy to sustain itself in this period also fell down. Even though you can look at absolutism as it emerged in around the 16th century or so, where you get this centralization of power underneath the monarchs through their kind of bureaucratic apparatuses that they establish, and they take away power from the aristocracies of their respective nations. But this is just like a step towards, essentially, this is Juvenal's point, that like as soon as the monarch
I thought absolutism was 18th century. Am I wrong? It was like 17th and 18th century. It wasn't 16th century. Because Louis XIV, I am the state. That was 17th century. Unless I'm totally off base.
centralizes power into himself, into his personhood, and establishes a bureaucracy to kind of administrate his political order, that eventually that bureaucracy will become self-aware that it can just get rid of the monarch. And that's ultimately what the revolutions that bring about the modern state achieve. And so, this is why democracy is the only game in town. But what's interesting, and what we're going to get into today, is that democracy, it's understood, and I made a video about this recently where I analyzed Carl Schmitt's The Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy. Democracy, particularly in the Anglosphere or the Anglophone world, it has that kind of hegemonic conceptual understanding given by liberalism. And this is why this structural conceptual distinction is important, because our argument that we're going to make today is that liberalism and nationalism are like diametrically opposed concepts that both fit the kind of democratic structure of society. And so
that's not really true. I mean, like, nationalism is contradictory to a lot of the underlying premises of really liberalism. But as I go into my series against the nation state, especially in part 2, we see how it was specifically like liberal ideology that gave rise to a particular conception of border control that eventually gave rise to modern nationalism. So, what do you mean 15th century for Louis XIV? Louis XIV was like, he lived from like 1650 or something to 1700s. No? That's a hell of a typo, Crane.
allowing democracy to become kind of hegemonically defined by liberals is a massive problem and a mind virus. So then people say, well, liberalism sucks.
Jesus
for
Christ,
XYZ
it's a
reasons,
mind
so we have
virus.
to turn to these
Oh, it's a typo. Fair enough, Crane.
reactionary ideas and critique democracy as such, rather than redefine democracy in nationalist terms as a kind of solution to liberalism. And so I think this is a far more productive way forward for, you know, our scene basically is to
Moi, je suis la tasse.
rephrase our discourse in these terms and get out of these like kind of confusing left-right distinctions. I think liberalism versus nationalism is the core distinction in modern politics.
They have a transition. He just gave up. God, look at his face. Keith is just completely confused.
kind of confusing left-right distinction.
Look, he's looking at the camera. He's like,
liberalism versus nationalism
shit.
is the core distinction in modern politics.
These people do not understand each other at all, but they're going to pretend. Goddamn, they're going to pretend hard. You know what it is? What I find kind of interesting about this, and it's juvenile, right? There's something kind of fascinating about just the sheer madness of the thing. Like, it's a dead end. They fundamentally don't understand what they're talking about. At bottom, they know they fundamentally don't understand what they're talking about. We all know that they know that what they're getting from this is just a feeling of pride from being able to run these sentences, at the very least to maintain flow. It doesn't make sense. You can't break it down. Actual, coherent sentences of political theory, even if they're wordy, they have, distinct, coherent meanings that you can break down fairly easily. Even reading Deleuze. I've read a little bit of Deleuze now. I'm wading slowly in. That stuff is coherent. The terms they use have a particular meaning. They're artful about it. It's complex. But there's a meaning. You read slow enough, it makes sense. This isn't even that complicated. It's not like the language is advanced. It's just they're not using words in a precise way. They're just using them in an economic way to produce the appearance of rigor. And it's just not there. It's just not there. Are they following some plan or script? I don't think so. Joel doesn't use a script, I don't believe. Oh, he's about to go into his blackboard. I wanna see this blackboard come up, okay? Let's just see what happens here.
Liberalism versus nationalism is the core distinction in modern politics.
Yeah, so with that, this is kind of the dichotomy we've constructed.
Alright, let's look at this. Liberalism versus nationalism. There's a spectrum. Abstract versus historical. Atomized versus ethnic. Liberalism is historical. What are you talking about? That's the whole idea of Whig history, right? Individuals produce society. Society produces individuals. These are not contradictory. Rousseau's a liberal. He's a smart liberal, but he's a liberal. And he argues that society produces individuals. Mercantile, managerial, oh for fuck's sake. And now they're bringing in Burnham. Adversarial, constructivist. What? Minoritarian? Liberalism is minoritarian. What does that even mean? Ruled by plurality, ruled by identity. Why would you want to be ruled by identity? Oh, for fuck's sake. General will and social contract? Why are these on different sides of the spectrum? The general will isn't opposite the social contract. The general will is the expression of the social contract.
For modernity. So it's not falling on
let's
left
just
versus right.
watch his theory here quickly.
It's basically liberalism versus nationalism. So why don't we start from the top? The spectrum goes from abstract to historical. Do you want to explain that one?
Please do.
So I put spectrum there because we need to understand liberalism and nationalism as a spectrum rather than purely as a dichotomy. Because obviously, pretty much all modern nation states are a combination of liberalism and nationalism. They kind of get mixed together in different flavors. So, France,
Didn't you just finish saying that they were incompatible?
the United States, Australia, they are liberal states, but they're also nationalist states because they're
Some of these terms aren't even opposites. I don't think any of these terms are opposites. Abstract isn't the opposite of historical. You can have an abstract history. That's the whole idea behind a social contract in some imagined historical origin point. Atomized versus ethnic, you can have an ethnicity composed of atomized individual subjects. Individuals produce society, and society produces individuals. These are both compatible. Society is comprised of individuals. Individuals in society produce other individuals. These are not...
nation states. But these are two conceptions of what generates essentially the popular sovereignty of the nation state, how the structural condition of democracy can translate into a theory of the state, essentially. So these two theories, I argue, are fundamentally contradictory, but nevertheless, you get in like kind of concrete historical reality a blend of these two contradictory ideas. So
Then upon what do they contradict? If they coexist, if they can cohabit, if they can be in the same place, do they actually contradict? Like, what do you mean? Do you mean people who idealize one or the other are in contradiction with themselves because they involve the other one that they've characterized as an opposite? Like, what is it? So what I'm hearing is it's a system, man. Something like that, yeah. Nationalism isn't all one thing, not these idiots who doubt that. I think that nationalism is rests upon spurious historical grounds in every case, but I think you're right. I think you're right. There is a form of nationalism that I do have respect for, and that's the kind of nationalism that basically is an abstract form of inclusive political identity. That's what you see in the French Revolution, the idea of citoyen, yeah? Where you incorporate. It's not about cutting yourself off from some unwanted other. It's about involving everyone from being in part of a stratified class-based society into one in which the citizens are equal, in which it's comprised entirely of citizens, and all citizens have rights and have equal standing with respect to each other, so that their identity is primarily with the community rather than with some subsection of it that benefits to their detriment or to the community's detriment.
the abstract versus historical and the atomized versus ethnic are both kind of closely related, but fundamentally the idea is that with liberalism you have a kind of abstract atomized conception of subjects, which is why I put down here individuals produce society, because the idea in liberalism, and this goes back to Hobbes, is that you have a set of atomized individual subjects and then they come together and form a kind of they basically have a set of rights they want guaranteed, a set of protections that they want as individuals. And so they come together and they form a state, they form a society that is organized underneath a legal system and a political system so that they can all kind of be protected. Versus the national conception, which is that there is a kind of historical and ethnic basis to the national identity, and that the state's identification with that historical and ethnic character produces its legitimacy. So liberalism obviously derives legitimacy from individuals, whereas the individuals within the nation state derive their rights from a kind of concrete historical and ethnic identification that they share in. So these are two different theories of citizenship. One is that we have, abstract atomized citizenship, like the libertarians are like the extreme view on this, that all of their rights precede the state and the state should only exist to protect their rights, versus the idea that society produces individuals under nationalism, the idea that like the kind of historical mission of a people and its ethnic character produces the kind of way in which individuals should be treated and respected, and what their rights are and what their responsibilities are.
Yes, this kind of flows from the abstract versus historical. So, I mean, this kind of gets back to like the neo-absolutist idea that Chris Bond wrote about before, of like the anarchistic ontology versus the absolutist ontology. So, obviously liberalism is based on this abstraction of like individuals kind of pre-existing the social order, and they come together to contractually produce this abstract order, whereas an absolutist ontology would say that we're already necessarily in a social order, we're already necessarily tribal, and law is downstream from that. It always starts with a collective. Now, where do you go from that? Well, what's your collective starting point? Well, we would say as nationalists that you have these organic collectives, which are ethnic groups, and necessarily.
Or are these people unable to conceive of any form of community other than an ethnic one? Because they want one. It makes them feel good about themselves. There's no satisfying answer to this. They're not coherent. He was almost right on the Hobbes point, but he's still wrong. Still wrong. We're not talking about rights-bearing individuals. We're simply talking about individuals with inclinations, aversions, and nothing above them to tell them which of those should be tempered and which of those should be indulged and when. As far as rights are concerned, they bear all rights to everything. Why? Because in the absence of any higher power, for Hobbes, I mean, an impingement on rights makes no sense, right? There's two ways to think about rights. I'm not going to get into the stupid Isaiah Berlin distinction because it's sort of obfuscating in and of itself. The idea of negative and positive rights. Rights are simply what you are allowed to do by the world. And if you exist in a world in which there is some power that can prevent you from, that can disallow you from doing certain things, then you don't have a right to do that. It's really very simple. And the reason why it gets into like contradictory territory, why it starts to seem kind of incoherent, is because you don't really have a right to jack. Rights don't really exist. Does Hobbes conflate a society with the state? No. No, he does not. No, he does not. Hobbes is... I think Hobbes might even be a little bit before society. Hi, Saints and Scholars. How are you? That's well put, Titan. This isn't rational, it's rationalization, pure confirmation bias where it's coherent at all. I agree with that.
Necessarily, that is the social order that's going to produce your society.
Yeah, so like liberalism is obviously associated with, you know, the Cartesian concept of the subject. It's associated with, you know, if you look at like Adam Smith and his theory of like the market, that ultimately the economic system is
$5 says that all he knows about Adam Smith is the fact that he talked about markets.
generated out of, you know, a set of individuals pursuing their self-interest.
I was right, invisible hand shit.
So under liberalism, you know, society is like emergent, whereas nationalism, I put down historical because it's saying, well, no, our capacity to identify as agents within an organized economic order or political order is bound up within this historical development of human society. And nationalism is fundamentally, I think, more compatible with, you know, the actual historical and anthropological evidence. Whereas, you know, if you
What does that
read
mean?
Hobbes or you read Adam Smith, their concept, it kind of doesn't really converge with history and anthropology. They don't.
I see what he means. So he's conflating any sort of social cohesion or any kind of non-individual, methodological individualist, well, I guess it's not a methodology if it's the fact of the case. Any situation in which the individual isn't the fundamental component of a community, and a community has some sort of ontological privilege above the individuals who make it up. He characterizes that as an ethnic community primarily. As like a, how do I want to characterize that? It's like a community governed by race on some level. How is nationalism not emergent? Nationalism isn't only emergent, it's emergent extraordinarily recently out of liberalism. These people are trying to make some kind of blood and soil argument for how, you know, human beings formed essentially nationalist states of the Richard Spencer variety since antiquity. They did not. They did not. It is a very recent mode of association. Not even really a mode of association, it's a mode of categorization. And it's never resulted in greater rather than less social cohesion. It's always just resulted in misery. And that's not even moralizing, it's because it's actually based on false information. It misunderstands the reasons why we, you know, the reasons why we get along. The things that we like. Because ultimately it's just reacting to... It's reacting to just how depressing and boring the modern world looks to someone who has no taste. Because here's the thing, we have a lot of really ugly cities, right? We have ugly buildings. We have a lot of annoying music. We have a lot of cheap, gross food. We fantasize about being in cyberpunk universes in which all this stuff is magnified and suddenly it's enchanted. There is one thing that keeps the current world from being fantastically interesting to most people. That's that we're used to it. The contemporary world is fantastically interesting. If you're not us.
Refer to it in any like great detail. Instead, they kind of do a thought experiment, like like a kind of imagine a set of individuals that already exist, that already have the capacity to reason their self-interest, and they've all got to get together and negotiate how they're going to organize their society. Now, this again is ahistorical because no such individuals ever existed. And our capacity to form rational subjectivity is embedded within forms of socialization. We get socialized to kind of become self-aware.
I don't think that's true. I think that individual does absolutely exist. But the point, however, is that the things that the qualities that individual bears are also laid on them by their social conditioning, right? Or their environmental conditioning. So even Rousseau, in his state of nature, his pure state of nature, thinks of human beings as not cohering in family groups for very long. And indeed, that sort of makes sense. Like we'll go beyond our human ancestors. We'll go to our primate ones. At some point, we had to have started forming family groups. Yeah, like it had to have started at some point. At some point, as animals, we must have just been basically just meeting for mating purposes on at a fairly distant level. There would be a mating season or whatever, sort of like deer, I guess, and then you'd go your separate ways and you wouldn't know who was related to you. Like that must have happened. I'm conjecturing. It would have been prior to us being like what biologists consider to be human today, but it must have happened at some level, maybe even before we were primates, but it must have happened
through the capacity to develop language, familial relations, communal relations. We're going to get taught how to become virtuous members in a society, how to rationally determine some kind of reality and its structure independent of our kind of subjective feeling. And so therefore, like the national idea of what makes a state valid, what makes its policies valid, is bound up with reference to this historical development. If you as a private citizen, you have your own private wills that go against the national character. The liberal idea, obviously, of things like mass immigration, that we can just bring someone in from a radically different ethnic group that doesn't share our history, but they're also an abstract, atomized individual. They can just come in and like participate in the market. We can give them citizenship documents, and they automatically become part of society, and they have the same rights as everyone else.
These imbeciles would have stopped Ibn Khaldun or Ibn Sina or I don't know who else. These people would have stopped brilliant scholars and philosophers from other cultures, other places at the border, because they were brown.
So liberalism has this kind of universal brotherhood of man, this kind of universal.
President Sunday, how would you categorize the economy of ancient Greece? I often see it being referred to as capitalist in virtue of containing markets, but that seems like a huge misnomer. Yeah, no, every economy has markets. The economy of ancient Greece? I mean, it's an economy only as a metaphor, right? Ancient Greece was not a unit. It's in the name. Economy, like it's from oikos, oikonomy, the law of the household. It refers to the internal management of a polis's resources, or specifically of a household's resources in ancient Greek usage of that term. It's not capitalist. Capitalist refers specifically to I'm not going to get into that here. It's not capitalist. People aren't bartering their labor in ancient Greece in the same way we do now. Yeah?
Properties that every individual has, whereas nationalism says no, the kind of concrete historical form of our people, our
States aren't valid, come at me. The state retorts, Swinlepet. Come at me. What are you going to do?
ethnic group, we have specific rights bound up within our nation state that are particular, that they don't just like extend towards all of humanity just by virtue of, you know, the fact that they're just another human being. Okay, so we see here this second set of dichotomies. Now, these dichotomies, I would argue, are implied by the original dichotomies.
These aren't dichotomies. I mean, case in point. It's in the social contract that Rousseau elaborates upon the general will concept. These aren't contradictions. The plurality is an identity. The plurality is a unity, yeah? It brings together the many into a one. When you say plurality, you are bringing together the many into one. The plurality is the singular of the many. You say, look, many people, they form a plurality. They form a community by means of the social contract, which expresses the general will of the many. Which is really the general will of the one. The many as one.
So, under liberalism, if we have this concept that, you know, we have these abstract, atomized individuals that come together to produce society, this ultimately develops a kind of mercantile elite necessarily, because if, you know, the state can't intervene in the market, the different market actors have their kind of individual rights that need to be protected by law that can't be intervened upon by the state. Then this produces an economic financial elite, a bourgeois elite, if you will, that they essentially will then dominate the political order versus the managerial elite, which emerges from the kind of social organization of the production of citizenship. That a managerial elite that has to actually kind of like run the state, and that identifies with this historical and ethnic character of the state.
21,000 views, guys. There is no God. I just want to talk about Bloodborne. Stuff like that. That's interesting. This is not interesting. This is so boring. This is so boring, Keith. See, what kills me is these people are smart. They could be deploying all this stuff they're reading, which is garbage. I mean, garbage in like an absolute sense. It's interesting to read de Maistre for his historical value. It's interesting to read. I'm not sure I want to say Juvenal is, de Juvenal is garbage. I think de Juvenal is interesting. But it's just... life's too short, guys. Really? It's too short. Dude, him holding the board while seriously staring at the camera is hilarious. Yes, it is. It really is. I think... do we want to keep going? I mean, we've come this far. 23 minutes in. Do we want to keep going? See, here's what's interesting about Bloodborne. Like, the school of Menses. It's just so... it's so interesting. See, Lovecraft had this trope in a lot of his stories, especially, like, I think the, not the Shadow Out of Time, the Haunter in the Dark or something. where some mathematician or whatever, they'd be getting at something. Because there's this whole idea of like math and metaphysics and whatever, like getting at like the code of the universe or something. And they're sort of getting behind it. They're discovering something horrifying behind it. And it's really important that it's horrifying, because that's where the interest lies. For some reason, we really love the fact that it's horrifying. Like, there's that line by, in Stanislaw Lem Solaris, by Jabarian. I can't remember if it's Jabarian who says it or if it's Snout. But Jabarian. It's Snow in this translation, which annoys me. Snout. I know in the Tarkovsky movie it's Snout. But he says something to the effect of, we don't want other worlds, we want mirrors. We're looking for other places like ours. Slightly different, but similar enough that we can imagine ourselves there. Just a mirror. A mirror that distorts things just enough that it's interesting. And yet, the interest in Lovecraft is that these brilliant scientists and rogue mathematicians and people have just basically gone sick from it. The interest lies precisely in the fact that these other worlds aren't mirrors. They are, though, but we'll get into that. They're they're weird. That's literally the word that's used. Weird tales, right? They're weird. They don't even have like the familiarity of being sinister, although they are sinister. They're crucially sinister, but we're told they aren't simply sinister. They're weird enough. Like, it's not even that they threaten us in like a reliable way. It's like that the mad Arabel Hazarad, the writer of the Necronomicon, says, in some weird extremes, even death may die. Right? Like, we lose even the familiarity of the things we typically fear. It's completely alien. And yet it's always just an inversion of what we already know, or some amalgamation of stuff that we're familiar with. Like, Cthulhu is just an amalgamation of things we know. Really is just an inversion of geometry we're familiar with. It's like, oh, like the things get smaller as they get further away. Let's invert that and confuse the hell out of us. So one of the sailors running from Cthulhu falls down a deep pit that appears to be an adjacent wall. It's not the fear of the unknown. It's the fear of the known. Because we don't really fear the unknown. We loathe the unknown with stuff that we know, stuff that we're scared of. The unknown can be wonderful. The unknown often is. You try a new dish you've never experienced before. It looks very strange. It's a weird little bulbous thing at a Chinese restaurant. Explosion of wonderful flavor, right? And now we look at this. This is all they got. Mirrors. They're dissatisfied with the world around them. But not really, because it pays their bills. But they're dissatisfied with the world around them. They're annoyed that there's no ethnic belonging. There's no reverence for history. And so they construe all of human history and this massive, unfathomable manifold of complexity and interest into a simple dichotomy. And it's boring. It's boring. Now, the interest about Lovecraft is that, like, he fetishizes the weird. He never gets there, not really. The closest he gets is in the stuff that's unstated. Or in the stuff that's, like, barely stated. So, like, in The Call of Cthulhu, people think of Cthulhu, right? That's the scary thing. But really, the scary thing is when they arrest the cult in the jungle or in the woods or whatever. And there's some faint reference to this weird polypus being in the dark, in the woods. This weird pale thing coming out of a swamp. And you never really know what that is. That's the scary part. Cthulhu himself isn't scary. Cthulhu is a discrete object, right? He's hit by a boat. Modern weaponry can kill Cthulhu. Cthulhu is not terrifying. What's terrifying is the idea that there's always something behind. There's something else behind. Something else behind. But even when you think of that, that's a really pedestrian thing, isn't it? Like, even when we're talking about politics, that's what we're talking about. It's like, well, what's the thing behind this? What's the thing behind that? There's a thing behind this we can't access. We aren't in the space where the secret is shared. And like, even creeping horror. Like, we're annoyed when the creeping horror is revealed too quickly. Like, we call it horror, but we love it. And we're bored by the notion that it doesn't exist. We love it. We need it. We don't read horror because it makes us feel horrible. We read it because it makes us feel good. And sometimes when it's done badly, it does because it's tasteless. But real horror, really good horror, we love that. We want to be there. We want to see it. We probably wouldn't if we were actually there, but we want to see it. Like Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer. It's really good. Do we want to be in that space? No, but also yes. Weirdly, what's cool about Bloodborne is that it takes what Lovecraft does, and other people have, other like media has done this before, but it does this really well. It takes what Lovecraft does with the individual scholars, like these isolated, weird kind of like loners or whatever that just go beyond the bounds of where man was meant to go. It imagines that a society did this, that a community did this. So the entire city of Yharnam is being led by its uncontrolled academics, unconstrained by concern for their community's well-being or whatever, just on a mad quest for knowledge of what lies beyond the mundane. I mean, it's weird, actually. I remember a long time ago, I had conversations with people who, for whatever reason, hated Michael Crichton novels because they thought he was anti-science, because his stories were always about scientists who, for ignoble reasons, just went blindly in pursuit of knowledge, not for the sake of knowledge, but for ignoble reasons, right? Like Jurassic Park. It's like, oh, it's science, right? Like, what's his name? The Hammond, the guy who runs the park, in the movie at least. He's talking to Ian Malcolm, and he's like, I can't believe I'm hearing this from a scientist. How can we stand on the foot of at the precipice of discovery and not act? And Ian Malcolm's like, well, your scientists were so obsessed with whether they could, they didn't stop to think if they should. Bloodborne is an exaggeration of a world in which people don't stop to think about what they should. And really not that much of an exaggeration. Because, you know, for us in our comfy chairs at our desks, the consequences have been wonderful. For the people whose skin was burned off in Hiroshima, where only their shadows remain, it was not. Would Cthulhu be a signifier containing signified traits which Lovecraft considered necessarily contradictory and impossible? I don't think so. I mean, Cthulhu is just an animal. Now, there's indications that there's something weird going on with him, of course. He's referred to by cultists, if memory serves, it's been a little while. He's referred to by cultists as dead Cthulhu. In his house in really a dead Cthulhu lies dreaming. The dead don't dream. That's an interesting phrase. The general theme is that there's something fundamentally not of us, right? But at the same time, he's a bipedal organism with a head on top of his shoulders. Gendered pronouns. Terrestrial features. Wings, scales, tentacles. Like, these are all characteristics of earthly animals. Someone who lives their entire life on the continent might find them odd, but tentacles are very common in the animal kingdom, really. I like Michael Crichton novels for sure, but he was also overtly anti-global warming. Really? He was anti-global warming. Interesting. Very interesting. That would explain some anti-science sentiment towards him. I didn't realize that. By the way, if you want a really good, more contemporary Lovecraftian story besides Annihilation, Michael Crichton's Sphere is so good. Sphere is so good. Not the film, the book. The book is really, really good. Yeah, Michael Crichton is dead. He died of cancer. Quite a while ago. It's a shame. He wrote books about how climate change wasn't actually happening. Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. See, when it was brought up to my attention, he was talking specifically about, it was like this kind of pessimistic attitude towards the scientific manipulation of nature or something like that. The Nightland by William Hope Hodgson is great too. I will look into that. That sounds really interesting. The point of cosmic horror is not the monster itself, but the fear and anxiety that comes when one realizes that humanity is insignificant before the forces of the cosmos. You know, I wonder about that. I don't know if it's the fact that humanity is insignificant. See, at various points in, like, especially when you go through like a high level education or something, I'm not trying to be like pretentious about this, but there are points at which your entire world reorients at multiple points, and everything that came before is thereby classified as, this is like a dark period, right? Know the significance of da-da-da-da-da. And your life kind of gets shorter as you start to, aggregate those little segments. Because at a certain point, you realize you're running out of those, yeah? I don't think the fear is the insignificance of humanity. I think the fear is the notion that this period of normalcy in your life, in your experience as an individual, that is the short little prologue, that this extensive, tortuous period of time is just the prologue to something alien and horrible that you will never wake up from. Like, the Christian view of hell, for example, is very strange when you think about it. Because your inclination is to view it as like an end point. This is where you end up. This is the bad place you end up in. But that's where you are for the majority of your existence. Because the whole idea is it lasts forever, yeah? I mean, like, there are interpretations of the text that suggest that it's not something that really can be described in terms of linear time, but if indeed that sentence makes sense, if time just is allowed to go on indefinitely, there are weird extremes where the order of the world shifts. You see, we say breaks down, but that's treating our time as like some kind of anchoring point where the order just shifts so that death is undone and we're just back in some weird state. It's weird. It's really weird. Like there's a whole like these people may be out of grace socially, right? But that's transient. That thing that categorizes these people as obviously the bad guys in some critical respect, that's transient. That's not permanent. It's permanent so long as I'm around. Permanent so long as you're around. It's not permanent though. Because we're not permanent. McIntyre video? I'll do that at some point. I don't like McIntyre very much. I think he's a bit pretentious. I think people lower their standards when it's someone vaguely reactionary who still plays by the rules. This is actually worse than Jordan Peterson. I hope you're not referring to me. Good God, if I'm worse than Jordan Peterson. Ugh. I kind of want to look at some Bloodborne stuff. Could we do that? Would that be weird? Hang on, let's look at some Bloodborne. Let's go over this. This is a smaller channel. It's weird because you think Bloodborne, it must be like just overflowing with views. It's like the most interesting Lovecraftian fiction to come out in a while. It's not even explicitly Lovecraftian, but it captures it. Yeah? Because I think the Lovecraftian isn't even in the character of the monster or of the unknown. It's really the approach to it. It's the idea that that this thing is approached primarily by like careful study and alienation from one society. That's the common thread. It's the alienation from the people around oneself. See, like Warhammer. Warhammer is very interesting. It has Lovecraftian elements, yeah? Like the warp is Lovecraftian in the sense that it's a tearing of reality and there are these tentacled monsters and inhabiting there and like the constant threat of madness. That's what like and whatnot. But there's a comfort in the fascistic society that is united against it. There's like a comfort there. I don't think what distinguishes Lovecraft is the tentacled monsters in another dimension. I think what distinguishes Lovecraft is the alienation from one's home and sources of comfort that is required to get there. So that once one becomes aware of the thing, one isn't simply aware of something that threatens humanity. That just puts you in the realm of Attack on Titan, right? Or of being any power, or any community, rather, not power, any community victimized by colonization of some kind, or the overbearingness of some extrinsic force. I think what it is the social alienation so that one faces this thing alone and one has zero recourse or capacity to organize with others of one's type to fight back or to survive or to cope. Because we can imagine like what you would do at the end of the world, right? It's almost a relief. It's like you just hug your loved ones and just wait for it all to go away. It's easy. Easy to deal with. It's the loneliness that does it. And I think what makes Bloodborne actually a little bit anti-Lovecraftian is that you lose that loneliness. It's all communal. The community dies. The community is investigating into this dark thing. Like the whole story is about communities doing stuff. And you're an outsider, of course, so you just kill them all. But like, you never really feel an emotional connection with the thing. Why? Because at no point is there an individual who's just alone. Just curious, have you had the chance to listen to the Magnus Archives, President Sunday? I haven't heard of those. What are those? Magnus Archives. That sounds really interesting. No, I want to hear Peterson's pseudo-Jungian interpretation of Bloodborne just for kicks. Ah, man. What would Peterson do with Bloodborne? Good God. Anyways, let's watch this. This is about the One Reborn, which is a boss from Bloodborne, which is really interesting by itself. You're going to have no context for this if you haven't played or watched anything about the game, but this is just super interesting.
Hey guys, and welcome back to Yarnam. Today we're in Yarhagul, which is a pretty weird place, even by the standards of Yarnam, which is in itself a very strange city. Yarhagul just really takes the cake. It's a really strange place occupied by a really strange group of people known as the Menses crew. So what's going on in Yarhagul today? We're gonna run through it. We're gonna collect a few bloodstone chunks and then take on the One Reborn boss. But while we do that, I'm going to talk a bit about what's actually happening here, especially regarding Menses and
You know what's weird? This is from 2016. I don't know if this man is still alive.
their so-called ritual. So, there's only a couple of questions that I'll really answer here. First of all, what did Menses want? What were they trying to achieve? And secondly, how do they go about it? Now, if you actually proceed beyond this area and get to the Nightmare Lecture Hall, second floor, there's a note on the ground which states, Master Willem was right. Evolution without courage will be the ruin of our race. Now, what does that really imply? Now, for me, that note was definitely left by a member of Menses, and what it basically alludes to is the fact that Menses, as a group, were trying to get away from the mentality of the rest of the Healing Church, which is that, you know, they wanted to ascend via the old blood.
This is a really important theme in Lovecraft. Getting away from the old. Think of Kant getting away from the schoolmen, yeah? That's like the common theme in a lot of fascist critiques of rationalism. Is just the movement away. Movement away from the collective. You lose that comfort. They never characterize it as comfort. They characterize it as like embeddedness in some kind of order or whatever, but the critique that they feel, that they never really get away from that. It's kind of what the Joker is, right? I was watching a video about comparing Joker scenes from The Dark Knight and the Joker movie. And there's a scene in both of them. There's one part where in the new one, Joaquin Phoenix says to the comedian host Murray, is like, nothing can't hurt me anymore. My life is nothing but a comedy. And there's a part in The Dark Knight where he's getting punched by Batman. He's like, you have nothing to threaten me with, nothing to do with all your strength. And think of like a Hobbesian logic, right? Where a society's power to sustain itself comes from the ability to rely on qualities intrinsic to human beings as members of a type to respond to certain kinds of stimuli. As soon as someone is unresponsive to the things you rely upon them to be viscerally afraid of, to be sufficiently predictable such that you can manipulate them. And I'm not saying that in an edgy way, like just in the sense of like, you can rely on certain responses to certain locutions, to certain threats, etc. They basically become non-human to you. You know, it's like from the Iliad. There are no binding oaths between men and lions. That's what happens here. The school of Menses, or, you know, like the rationalists, or the people who are doing some kind of critique. Yeah? Oh, I dented it. Oh. It's gonna bother me forever. Some kind of critique. They are moving away from the comfort of being embedded in a community that just, you know, agrees on some things. People need that. But they're going into weird extremes that invalidate everything that came before. They're destroying the world. That's sort of what's going on here. Like, it's such a pregnant statement. Like, they're going away from the church or whatever. It's interesting.
And, you know, change the form.
And it sounds terrifying, but we love it.
Menses, I don't think, wanted to do that. They wanted to actually commune with the Great Ones themselves on a more cerebral, mental level, just like Willem was trying to do by lining his brain with eyes. And that also explains why there was a split between Menses and the Healing Church. The Healing Church was still old-fashioned, and that's why they sent Edgar into the nightmare to spy on the rest of the Menses people, and that's why you find him in the Nightmare of Menses. Now, but getting back to Menses themselves, if you read the description for the Menses Cage, which you get after you kill Mikolash, it states that the cage is a device that restrains the will of the self, allowing one to see the profane world for what it is. It also serves as an antenna that facilitates contact with the Great Ones of the dream. And that's the most important line. That's what really Menses wanted to do. They wanted to contact and commune with the Great Ones in order to ascend, at the very least mentally, or at least learn from them what they were and how they can, you know, achieve greatness themselves. And also it's worth noting that during Mikolash's boss fight, again in Menses, he actually talks a lot about Koz. He talks more about her, and pretty much only about her for the entire boss fight. So he knows her history, and I assume that means that he knows that she is dead and that she had left an orphan behind, and that's really important.
I hate when I lend people my books and they bring them back with the spine broken. Oh God, I would never forgive someone who did that. Funny story, actually. Ambrose and I, at our university one time, a long time ago, I was hosting a booth for a club. So stupid. I wanted to host like a debate club. It was so lame. Nothing ever came of it. I was too undisciplined to actually run it. Never happened. I had this fantastic idea of having like Oxford-style debates at this tiny Canadian university. But at the time, I was reading Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism, and I had it in my hands at our booth. And I'm reading it. Ambrose comes by. He says, "Oh, what are you reading?" I was like, "Oh, this." And he takes it from me. And he looks at it and he goes, and he folds the spine 90 degrees. I still haven't forgiven it. Anyways. That's not true. I've forgiven it, but it came at cost.
But before we go on, let's go back to the beginning, you know, about Bloodborne as a game. What is this really all about? Now, if you read the third chord, it states that every great one loses its child and then yearns for a surrogate. This pretty much sums up the entire, you know, lore of the game, in my opinion. Everything that we're doing, everything that the Yarnamites were doing is basically about this. They knew and they understood that the great ones lost their children and were yearning for a replacement. And in order to ascend for themselves, they were trying to find a surrogate which they could use. And if you go on to Yahoo itself, there's a lore note on the ground which reads, "Nightmarish rituals crave a newborn, find one, and silence his harrowing cry. So clearly, Menses were looking for a newborn so they could replace it, draw in the Great Ones.
I would have punched a face. Nah, you wouldn't have punched a face as pretty as Ambrose's, I'm sorry to say.
By offering this child. But what newborn does this note refer to? Who were they actually trying to use? Now, most people will tell you that it was Murgo, and I don't think that's necessarily false, but I was also, especially after the DLC, tempted to think that it was referring to the Orphan of Kos. But really, now that I think about it, I think it refers to both. Remember, nightmarish rituals crave a newborn. It doesn't say that it craves the newborn, it craves any newborn. They were looking for something that was akin, or a baby Great One themselves, in order to draw in Odin or Kos. Kos being the mother of the Orphan of Kos, and Odin being Murgo's father, I assume. But of course, Odin was formless and exists only in voice, and Kos is dead. So how did they actually go about this? How did they go about, getting to Murgo or to the Orphan? Now, one thing that's really...
Speaking of separations, people don't really appreciate just what a divorce Kant was from ways of conceiving experience and knowledge there too. He characterized his move, Kant, in the Critique of Pure Reason, as a Copernican revolution, or as like the Copernican revolution. The Copernican revolution was a move from thinking of the Earth as the center of the solar system to the Sun as the center of the solar system. Kant relocated the locus of our knowledge from things outside in the world coming into our heads somehow, to our heads responding to things in the world to produce the stuff that we experience. Fundamentally limiting what kinds of metaphysics we can do, because it limits the extent to which we can get outside of the physical to actually think. That's the whole idea behind the Transcendental Aesthetic. We are constrained by space and time because those are the conditions of our knowledge and experience and thought. We are in a weird place. And this move, which we all take for granted, like a lot of people online, they like to think of this as just like being old hat, or as being, people do Kant a big disservice. He's dumber, less integrated, less holistic Hegel, because Hegel's sexy right now, because Hegel is Marx without all of the baggage. But everything prior to Kant is in brackets since Kant.
Really interesting is that the boss in this area, the Orphan of the one reborn, is a very strange creature because it doesn't really fit in with Murgo himself. It's like, if they need to get access to Murgo, why do they need the other? Why do they need two? And I think the answer to that is that basically they were trying to hedge their bets. They actually had two rituals going. One to actually get an audience with Murgo, and the second one to actually somehow get the Orphan of Kos. Now, if you read the third core description that you get from the Murgo's wet nurse, once you kill her,
Is that the Pluhar translation you have? Yes, indeed it is. It is, in my opinion, the best English translation. And you can see on the shelf behind me that I got the trilogy set. I got the Critique of Judgment in Pluhar and the Critique of Practical Reason in Pluhar. The Cambridge is nice, but they're overpriced, and apparently the translation actually is a little bit too literal in places.
States that this code granted Menses audience with Murgo, but resulted in the stillbirth of their brains. Now, obviously they were successful in one regard. They created the nightmare of Menses, and as his code states, were able to commune with Murgo himself, for, I assume, the reason being that they wanted to actually gain access to Odin through him. But what's interesting for me is the fact that when you actually meet Mikolash, as I stated before, he doesn't talk about Murgo or Odin. He's talking about Kos. And I think what that really implies the fact that they tried to speak to Murgo, but he wasn't really giving them what they wanted. They weren't able to actually, commune with him or with Odin, which is what they really wanted. And I think he's basically just lost at that point and loses his mind and just rambling around trying to figure out how to contact Kos. So that was the first ritual, and obviously it was kind of semi-successful because they were able to create the nightmare, but they weren't able to commune with Odin. Now the second ritual...
By the way, talking about contingency. If you're not already familiar with Bloodborne's lore, the stakes of this are going to be completely... They're going to go over your head. Those are the stakes. The things that matter to you the most. Some other protagonists somewhere in the future, if protagonists still exist, it's just going to be weird. How real is the split between analytic and continental philosophy these days? I think it's largely in terms of style and in terms of focus. Really, I don't think there is a strong distinction between the two. And as you go into people like the pragmatists, for example, it starts to break down, even in terms of style. Do you know of any pamphlets or smaller works of Kant to read before the critiques? I have read the Prolegomena and Groundwork, but I was wondering if there were any others you recommend. I would just dive into the Critique of Pure Reason, man. Honestly, if you've already read the Prolegomena, and the Groundwork, you're good to go. Just do it. Just do it. It's not that hard. Oh, pragmatism represent? I'm actually moving to becoming a pragmatist myself, essentially. I've been reading a ton of Peirce and Rorty recently. This book, by the way, Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, it is so good. It is so good. I'm going to be doing videos on this in the near future. This is one of the best books I've read. I've read. It is so good. I'm also reading Wilfrid Sellers at the moment. Science, Perception, and Reality. Ugly cover, but it's so interesting. Pragmatists, as far as English philosophers are concerned, by English I mean American, that's where it's at. It really is where it's at.
In order to understand this, you really need to look around in Yahagul. What do you see everywhere when you actually get there? You see caskets, you see bones, you see towards the boss fight the petrified remains of the citizens of Yharnam, and you also see undead wolves, and you see undead, basically caskets that are filled with bones that just come alive. So what exactly was going on here? I think those two things, they were trying to collect the bones of dead Yharnamites and actually live Yharnamites, plus a second item, which was basically the yellow backbone. When I kill the orphan, the one reborn, when I actually get to that boss fight, you'll see that he drops the yellow backbone. And if you read the description of that item, it states, special body parts collected by the Healing Church. What was the gruesome bait used to lure? So clearly the Healing Church was trying to collect yellow backbones from places, and you can actually get them in certain parts of the old labyrinth. I think it's the labyrinth warrior enemies that actually drop it. And so if you go down to the different dungeons and you fight them, they do have a chance of dropping the yellow backbones. And I think that the church was collecting them, and Menses was collecting them, in order to try and put together a new version of Murgo. Sorry, not new Murgo, but the Orphan of Kos. And why would they do that? They want to attract Kos herself. Now, the One Reborn is really interesting because he's actually, if you look at him, what you realize, he looks pretty much like the Orphan. If anybody's fought the Orphan before, the One Reborn actually looks like a combination of Kos herself as a dead body and the Orphan. So that's one piece of evidence. And second of all, he actually drops the yellow backbone, the One Reborn, when he dies, which shows that he's made up of it. And so it seems to me like the School of Menses was colluding with the Bell.
So, one thing that FromSoft likes to do, especially since Dark Souls 1, is to make bosses that are amalgams of corpses. Gravelord Nito obviously is an amalgam of skeletons. The Rotten in Dark Souls 2 is an amalgam of, fleshy corpses. Basically like this, actually. But less interesting looking. In Dark Souls 3, you have Aldrich, Saint of the Deep, who is this weird sludge that assimilates other beings. And then here it appears that the School of Menses tried to construct an old one, which is strange because, or I guess a great one, not an old one, because they remove. Actually, that's kind of interesting. So a major part of Lovecraft is time. The old ones aren't just beyond humanity; they are far before us. There's so much emphasis on the deprivileging of the stuff that we consider to be like the oldest substance of meaningful history, right? Look. Hegel's Science of Logic. This is an old book. Old. Old. And yet. When was it written? 1800s? This isn't old. This is as recent as Harry Potter. Sorry, I insist on having my books stacked in order from widest to narrowest. I'm OCD that way. I'm convinced for some reason they will all fall down if I don't. It's really dumb. But there it is. It's obsessed with a deep privileging of what we consider to be the relevant qua the human in place of the relevant qua the something, because it's so far beyond us and has so little regard for us that we don't even know it exists or we know what it is. Like, look. Copernican revolution in thought. How many billions of these took place before humanity even existed on a Lovecraftian lens? Like, President Sunday, have you read Being and Event by Alain Badiou? He tries to bridge the divide between continental and analytic traditions. It's also an interesting response to earlier philosophers. I might at some point. There's too much to read. There's just too much. There's just way too much.
Bell ringing women in order to enact this second ritual in which Menses would provide the dead bodies and the yellow backbones, and the bell ringing women would bring them back to life. And obviously their intention was to bring a new version of the orphan back to life, and that's what the one reborn is. He's not, the one undead. It's not as if it's just undead bodies. It was an attempt to rebirth the orphan of Kos in order to attract Kos herself. But obviously, as we know, when we get there, you see the one reborn, but you don't see Kos anywhere. So obviously that itself failed. But I mean, that's quite a speculative theory. I assume other people probably thought of it themselves, but me personally, I quite like it. And even though, in my mind, it fits together. So I like it. So I want to stick with that theory. The boss fight itself, a lot of people tend to start, and I used to do this as well, by taking on the bell ringing women on the sides by climbing up the stairs. But to be honest, I don't think you really need to do that.
If you could install a database of books into your brain, would you? I can, and I am slowly attempting to do so. If you mean could I install them all at once? No. I feel like I'd lose my identity very quickly. Like if I underwent all of the changes that happens to a person as they gradually read things that fundamentally change how they view the world, I'd lose myself. Or I just wouldn't process them properly.
It's not an easy boss, but it's not the most difficult either. Just make sure you equip bolt paper onto your weapon, and then also get some beast blood pellets, because you really want to attack this guy really aggressively.
Have you read Ubik by Philip K. Dick? I want to read a lot of this stuff. You know what? I have a lot of trouble reading some older science fiction. It's not because the ideas aren't interesting. They're more interesting than a lot of science fiction today. I think it's because, like, despite the interest that I have in everything, I'm really attached to the emotionality of a lot of more, like, human media. Like, I like Mass Effect because you're surrounded by people who are, like, attractive friends, basically. In a non-sexual sense, but, like, like, you have enjoyment being around the characters. And so even if there's all of this, like, hyper-alienating stuff, it's like, it's approached as part of a community. This is one of the reasons I think why one of the ways in which Warhammer 40k is made attractive, despite the extreme repressiveness of its universe, even on the human end, is that the fascistic nature of the human community is such that you never experience that alienation that is attendant upon most Lovecraftian fiction. Instead, it actually the alienness of the universe secures the community to an extreme degree. Like, it's comforting. People characterize the world of 40k as being somewhere you'd never want to be. That's not true. People fantasize about being in that world. They're wrong, but they fantasize about it. So I have a lot of difficulty reading a lot of this old stuff because it's cold. Like, Foundation. Fantastically interesting in the abstract, but its characters it treats as expendable and meaningless. As a function of its story, of course. But it's just... it feels like the literary equivalent of toilet paper, I guess, because everything seems disposable. Which is not a comment on the quality of writing. It's really good. I recommend it. But it just feels like an extended death sequence. Does that make sense? Like, I like Ender's Game primarily, not because of like the political content, but because you feel like you're with people when you're reading it. In fact, one of the disappointing things about fiction like that is when it's rendered in a real life format, like in films, say, and you realize how hollow it actually is. Because the people are ugly, they hate each other. Not ugly in like an aesthetic sense, but in the sense that, there are no deep connections between most of the characters. The world is just a aggregate of hallways and rooms. Everything's temporary, nothing means anything. It's depressing. President Sunday, that is why I can't get into a Game of Thrones. A Game of Thrones fetishizes this. Like, a Game of Thrones is extraordinarily unrealistic. Communities like that wouldn't be tolerable for very long. Do you believe a utopian society could lead to a loss of identity? I think a utopian society represents a loss of identity categorically. That's why it's utopian. It's a no place, yeah? It's a non-place. It's a place that doesn't exist. It's always a loss of identity because it's not a place that relates to us now. It's a place that is in some sense permanently separate from us. Past some threshold we can only imagine. That's why utopian fiction originates from Britain. It's the island empire, the view of everywhere from nowhere. It's the panopticon of the world.
Keep attacking him, keep hitting him, and you will eventually, take him down. Okay guys, that's pretty much it for today. Thanks again for watching. As usual, if you enjoyed it,
This guy's cool. I don't know why he only has 1,000 subscribers. I feel like a lot of these really interesting channels are just drowning, and I don't know why. Of course, I'm wondering about that, because I think mine's one of those, but... Monkaroot, I don't know what you're arguing about exactly, but it's annoying me. If you could stop, that'd be great. Dystopian fiction can arise from anywhere people are writing. Yeah, but dystopian fiction is lazy. Utopian fiction is interesting. Dystopian fiction, like what's at stake in a dystopian novel? Like what's Hunger Games? It's not some imagined place beyond our conception. It's not some new order that has starting from scratch somewhere in the future. It's always just like here's a world with a bad government. That's dystopian fiction. It's boring. Dystopias as a genre are boring. 1984 isn't a dystopia. 1984 is... The horror of 1984 are systems. It's not a place. It's not a bad state. It's an impeccable state. It's a perfect state. It's a perfect state that is fundamentally hostile to everything that we hold dear, but it's perfect. At least it seems to be perfect. It seems like its system could run forever. Have you read Perdido Street Station? It's a little pretentious and pretty long, but fascinating. It won the Arthur C. Clarke Award in 2001. I haven't. What's it about? I'm interested. Not really, you can't essentialize a genre like that. Sure you can. It's what it means to be in a genre. I don't know if teen dystopian fiction should be propped up as the pinnacle or representation of dystopian fiction in general. I don't know. I haven't seen much to the contrary to break my perception that way. It seems to me that dystopian fiction generally is just some spin on 1984 but missing the point. The horror of 1984 has very little to do with the fact that the government is repressive. The monks in The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco are repressive. The horror is the way in which language and systems of control and surveillance and the artificial construction of persons and texts puts you into a house of mirrors where you lose all sight of reality and reality loses all sight of you. If it's so perfect, why does the state of 1984 allow so much decay? Because it can. Because the purpose of the state in 1984 is not to keep everything well. It's to keep everything in its place. Genre is something we use to categorize and sort fiction. Fiction itself isn't written to check genre staple boxes. I agree with that. Except when people are writing specifically to appeal to a genre's audience. So, most dystopian fiction since 1984, with a few exceptions, has been written primarily to capitalize on an audience that already enjoys 1984. And I disagree with the notion that stuff like the Hunger Games and whatnot is intended specifically for a young audience. Yeah, it was marketed that way. Yeah, the authors probably expected it to be competing with Harry Potter. But you know what? These are adult novels. There is nothing about them that is juvenile. There really isn't. Like, why would we think so? Why? Because their protagonists are people in their late teens? Alexander the Great was. 1984 is an overrated horror story. No, I disagree. I think 1984 is brilliant because it emphasizes the role of language on our capacity to think in a specifically political context. That's what's interesting about it. The interest in 1984 is primarily in newspeak. It's not in the world itself. Like, the world itself is just various iterations of the same, right? There's more to it than that. Like, I think the whole of 1984 is interesting. But for me, newspeak was the specifically interesting characteristic, a feature of it. Where there's where whole universes of meaning are lost just in the contraction of language into fewer and fewer phrases that contain more content and thereby erase it. Because if we lose specificity, we lose distinction. You know what novels I really want to read? And I don't know why exactly. I think it's just because I've heard of it in a positive context. And it sounds sort of like this stupid track I listen to sometimes. I actually really love a lot of this like royalty-free music. Like, I play that Sunset over Glengorm theme quite a bit on my intros, or at least I used to. But the Gorman Gas trilogy. And it's literally just because Gorman Gas sounds sort of similar to Glengorm that I kind of want to read it. And I like the feel of Glengorm, but I have a feeling Gorman Gas has nothing to do with that, but I still really want to read it. I want to read the Gorman Gas trilogy. I don't know why. I just want to. People say it's good. I don't know, man. I read The Hunger Games when I was like 10 years old. It's for babies. That doesn't mean anything. Look, The Once and Future King is often marketed as a young adult's novel. That's not a young adult's novel. There is no age restriction on novels. They deal with material that matters, or they deal with material that doesn't, and that's basically it. But if it allows decay, then it seems that it becomes more difficult to keep things in its place. Do you mean in terms of social and economic class? Sort of. Like, stuff can be in flux, right? Like, the world can be in a constant state of decay and desperate rebuilding, but the point is that the party stays in control. Humanity is the party. That's the goal of the state in 1984. So long as humanity is the party, as long as the party is all of humanity, as long as the party is the only thing that retains anything of the human at all, as long as it is the protagonist of history and nothing else challenges it, the system works. Because the system works if it works for what you want it to work for. Perdido Street Station takes place in a city-state run by an authoritarian council. Most people are hybrids with animals, some who come from very unique societies. Interesting. I mean, it loses points for being furry stuff, but it's interesting. I'm gonna grab some water. I'll be right back. Let's play the next one of these while I'm gone. It's just interesting.
Hey guys, welcome back to the city of Yharnam. Things are really heating up now. We're getting towards the end of our journey and everything's going to get a lot tougher. The bosses are going to get tougher. So you're going to find me, getting my ass kicked a lot basically. So today we're going to head into the Nightmare of Menses. First into the Nightmare Lecture Hall and then straight into the main part of the Menses area. And then before we actually face off with Mikolash, the host of the Nightmare. So, what am I going to talk about today? I really want to talk a lot about the nightmare realms themselves, or the dreamlands, whatever you want to call them, and how they're actually put together and the nature of those areas. First of all, let's talk about which areas in the game constitute the nightmare, or the dreamlands. You've got two main sets. First of all, the areas that are associated with Menses. That's the lecture building, where we're in now, the Nightmare Frontier, and we were there a few episodes ago, and the Nightmare of Menses. They're all associated with Menses for me for various reasons, but the most important fact we need to understand is that they're all connected. It's pretty much, these are the most closely related areas that you can actually walk from one to another. You can walk straight from the lecture building to the Nightmare Frontier or to the Nightmare of Menses. The second set of areas in the main game aren't connected, but they're worth mentioning. First, the Hunter's Dream and the Moonside Lake. Now, what I want to talk about quickly is the fact that just because the Hunter's Dream is called a dream, that doesn't mean it's necessarily a good thing or a positive place. I mentioned before in another video that the Hunter's Dream could just be an allusion to hell or purgatory. So just because it's called a dream, it's not necessarily a good place. And, the fact that the areas run by Menses, the Nightmare Frontier and the Nightmare of Menses, are called nightmares, that doesn't necessarily mean, in my mind at least, that they're, very negative areas. They're pretty messed up places, when you get there, but technically so is the Hunter's Dream. But it's just a play on words, and really they're pretty much all the same thing. They're all, constitute the dreamlands in this world, and they're all, basically inhabited by really strange creatures, including the Great Ones. So how are the nightmares created? Where do they come from? Now, if we read the description of the third chord we get from the abandoned workshop, it states that the third umbilical cord precipitated the encounter with the pale moon, which beckoned the hunters and conceived the hunter's dream. This showed that you can use a third chord to actually make contact with the Great Ones, to actually, conceive a dream or, a nightmare realm. So it seems to me what happened in that case was Gurman and probably Lawrence and his so-called associates got together and concocted a ritual to basically draw in the Great One known as the Moon Presence, who we're going to meet at the end of this run, and actually conceive the dream itself. Now, if you read another chord that you get from Murga's wet nurse when you kill her, it states that this chord granted Menses audience with Murgo, but resulted in the stillbirth of their brains. So again, in this case, we see that the third chord itself is used by Menses to actually conceive another dream, which obviously is the Nightmare of Menses, and basically so that they can actually converse with Murgo and probably Odin as well.
Stillbirth of their brains, that's a good phrase to describe Keith and Joel.
And if you read the third chord you get from Ariana's child, it states, to think it was corrupted blood that began this eldritch liaison. So from all this, we know that pretty much you need third chords in order to make contact with the Great Ones. And when you make contact, you do so by entering this realm of the nightmare or the dreams. Now, of course, there are other rituals involved in this process. We don't know what they are exactly, but the point is that you need the chord to actually do it. And it's also worth knowing that you actually need a human being to actually interact with the Great Ones. What do I mean by that?
President Sunday, what is your take on the notion of bad things could actually be good and good things might not be so great? Seems like a common trope. I guess I just think of kind of like this trope from Lost, where the others, like this secret society doing horrible things, they turn out to be like doing so for a good cause. A weird fetishization of cruelty and whatnot as being like, well, just the hard things the good guys actually have to do because of secret reasons normal people aren't privy to, but it always ends up being the case that the explanation is disappointing because only stupid people think that way. Nobody really has secret knowledge of that order. Now, as for bad things could actually be good, I mean, you grow up in a repressive environment. Maybe ideologically, maybe intellectually, maybe sexually, etc. You're missing out on stuff that would make you happy. It's construed as bad things, right? So, it's all kind of obvious. It's a common trope because like we can be wrong about stuff. That's about it.
Like that. Now, if you read the description of the moon rune, it states, "The great ones that inhabit the nightmare are sympathetic in spirit and often answer when called upon." Now,
That's a remarkably non-Lovecraftian thing. The great ones that inhabit the nightmare are sympathetic. I guess because they inhabit the nightmare. The nightmare is an artificial creation, kind of a simulated world of some kind, or just like a pocket universe or something, where some level of translation between great ones and human beings is possible. And I guess only sympathetic great ones would attempt to communicate, because other ones might pass by us kind of like the three-dimensional object in Flatland, you know? Like just hovering above us. Actually, that'd be a good thing to end off on.
In discussing the large-scale structure of the cosmos, astronomers sometimes say that space is curved, or that the universe is finite but unbounded. Whatever are they talking about? Let's imagine that we are perfectly flat. I mean absolutely flat, and that we live, appropriately enough, in a flatland, a land designed and named by Edwin Abbott, a Shakespearean scholar who lived in Victorian England.
That always reminds me of my dad for some reason. I don't really know why.
Everybody in flatland is, of course, exceptionally flat. We have squares, circles, triangles, and we all scurry about, and we can go into our houses and do our flat business. Now, we have width and length, but no height at all. Now, these little cutouts have some little height, but let's ignore that. Let's imagine that these are absolutely flat. That being the case, we know, us flatlanders, about left-right, and we know about forward-back, but we have never heard of up-down. Let us imagine that into flatland, hovering above it, comes a strange three-dimensional creature which, oddly enough, looks like an apple. And the three-dimensional creature sees an attractive, congenial-looking square, watches it enter its house, and decides in a gesture of interdimensional amity to say hello. "Hello," says the three-dimensional creature. "How are you? I am a visitor from the third dimension." Well, the poor square looks around his closed house, sees no one there, and what's more, has witnessed a greeting coming from his insides, a voice from within. He surely is getting a little worried about his sanity. The three-dimensional creature is unhappy about being considered a psychological aberration, and so he descends to actually enter flatland. Now, a three-dimensional creature exists in flatland only partially. Only a plane, a cross-section through him can be seen. So when the three-dimensional...
Now we're thinking of this as if we are operating from the perception of the flat creatures in Flatland. But to the apple, to the three-dimensional object, that's not even a place. And yet, this is what we do when we try to construe the world in terms of international relations theory. That's literally what we reduce the entire world to. Is a non-place, just a two-dimensional like shapes with abstract qualities we attach to them. That's what ethno-nationalism does. That's what all these different categorization schemes that have wide uptake in political and global analysis do. They're as impoverished as an analogy from the vantage point of an element in the analogy. Like, to the apple, this isn't even a place. Flatland as a world is just an object. It's an object it can choose to move into and move out of, in the sense of, like, walking into a wall or not. But it's not a place, not really. There's no difference to the apple.
The creature first reaches flatland, it's only the points of contact which can be seen, and we'll represent that by stamping the apple in this ink pad and placing that image in flatland. And as the apple were to descend through, slither by flatland, we would progressively see higher and higher slices, which we can represent by cutting the apple. So the square, as time goes on, sees a set of objects mysteriously appear from nowhere and inside a closed room and change their shape dramatically.
Not just change their shape, but separate objects which seem to have no material relation with each other, yet are seemingly connected. Like, it's basically every ghost story you've read.
His only conclusion could be that he's gone bonkers. Well, the apple might be a little annoyed at this conclusion, and so, not such a friendly gesture from dimension to dimension, makes a contact with the square from below and sends our flat creature fluttering and spinning.
See, look, this is characterized in, like, sort of comic, funny, wholesome terms. But this is Lovecraftian fiction being described here. And the social element is central here, because watch what happens.
Above flatland. At first, the square has no idea what's happening. He's terribly confused. This is utterly outside his experience. But after a while, he comes to realize that he is seeing inside closed rooms in flatland. He is looking inside his fellow flat creatures. He is seeing flatland from a perspective no one has ever seen it before to his knowledge. Getting into another dimension provides as an incidental benefit a kind of X-ray vision. Now our flat creature slowly descends to the surface, and his friends rush up to see him. From their point of view, he has mysteriously appeared from nowhere. He hasn't walked from somewhere else. He's come from some other place. They say, for heaven's sake, what's happened to you? And the poor square has to say, well, I was in some other mystic dimension called up. And they will pat him on his side and comfort him, or else they'll ask, well, show us, where is that third dimension?
So think of, like, Plato's Republic, right? So somebody is agitated somehow. They're loosened from their chains from the people in the cave, staring at the shadows in the wall. They go up a long and rugged ascent until they get to the surface of the world, and they're blinded by the sun. They can only see its reflection until eventually they acclimate to the light of the world of the surface, and they can eventually see everything in its proper place, including even the sun itself, if only for a short time. And they go back down, because they want to save the other people who are locked up, and they won't listen. They think he's crazy. They have no point of reference for what he's talking about. That's Lovecraftian fiction. It's the horror of that, without the assurance that the light above gives you any added clarity as well. You're just alone. But perversely, you also become the protagonist of history, because all these other people are playing a game under false pretenses. They don't realize what's going on. That's sort of what we get also with like The Expanse, right? Like, James Holden is the protagonist. Why? It's not because he's really in and of himself, like, better than any other character. He's not smarter, he's not more powerful, but he knows. He's part of the real dialectic of history.
Dimension, point to it, and the poor square will be unable to comply. But maybe more interesting is the other direction in dimensionality. What about the fourth dimension? Now, to approach that, let's consider a cube. We can imagine a cube in the following way. You take a line segment and move it at right angles to itself in equal length. That makes a square. Move that square in equal length at right angles to itself, and you have a cube. Now, this cube, we understand, casts a shadow. And that shadow we recognize. It's, ordinarily drawn in third grade classrooms as two squares with their vertices connected. Now, if we look at the shadow of a three-dimensional object in 2 dimensions, we see that, in this case, not all the lines appear equal. Not all the angles are right angles. The three-dimensional object has not been perfectly represented in its projection in 2 dimensions, but that's part of the cost of losing a dimension in the projection. Now, let's take this three-dimensional cube and project it, carry it through a 4th physical dimension. Not that way, not that way, not that way, but at right angles to those 3 directions. I can't show you what direction that is, but imagine that there is a 4th physical dimension. In that case, we would generate a 4-dimensional hypercube, which is also called a tesseract. I cannot show you a tesseract because I and you are trapped in 3 dimensions. But what I can show you is the shadow in 3 dimensions of a 4-dimensional hypercube or tesseract. This is it.
That's a Kantian notion, by the way, the idea that we're limited by our being constituted along specific dimensional lines. I mean, that's not exactly the language that Kant uses, but, our thought and our experience. They are presented to us at some fundamental level, spatially and in sequence that we can't transcend. Same here.
And you can see it's 2 nested cubes, all the vertices connected by lines. And now the real tesseract in 4 dimensions would have all the lines of equal length and all the angles right angles. That's not what we see here, but that's the penalty of projection. So you see, while we cannot imagine the world of 4 dimensions, we can certainly think about it perfectly well. Now, imagine a universe just like Flatland.
Imagine a universe just like Flatland. The international system of states. That's the fundamental problem with modern political theory in a lot of cases, at least in terms of international relations and geopolitics, etc., is that it's 2-dimensional, right? It's fundamentally 2-dimensional. Like, we know it's wrong. But the picture has its own force. Because we're all playing as if it's real. So, it becomes real. To an extent. I don't know if you saw, but would Husserl's phenomenology have anything to say here? I don't know. I haven't read a lot of Husserl. Read a bit. Didn't understand it. I'm going to go back to it at some point. I've learned from an intelligent young friend that Husserl's writings have mostly not even been published. So it's possible almost nobody, at least in English, or maybe anyone, really knows what Husserl really has to say. Well, it's almost 1:30 a.m. We're almost at 2.5 hours, meaning I've been streaming for about 6 hours. Not really today, from yesterday to today, so I think it's time to sleep. Maybe I'll stream tomorrow night too. The damned pink grid. Oh, serious, you wanted me to watch something. What was it again? Looks like it is light outside. It's not light outside here. Serious, you mentioned something. And I ignored it. What was that? Oh, the problem with human rights. That's right. I'll do that one next, okay? Promise. My voice is going, so I don't know if I can survive another stream. But I'll give that one a look. There's lots of time. I'm going to be doing lots of these. I'm doing this full time now, so we'll have lots. Yeah, that was Cuck Philosophy's video. I like Cuck Philosophy. He can be shallow at parts, but he usually is very good. Anyways. Have a good night, everyone. Or a good morning, if you're anywhere near where I am. Take care.